Imagine a bandleader who lost almost all their best musicians in one night. The reason? Well, they were so focused on taking a huge cut of a $10,000 gig that their musicians, feeling severely undervalued, basically quit on the spot and started a competing band. The problem wasn't just the money, it was a lack of transparency and a flawed understanding of what makes a band business work. So you don't want to make that same mistake. Over the past 5 years, my team and I have analyzed over 30,000 individual musician payouts from gigs managed inside the Back on Stage system. And in this video, I'm going to share exactly what that data reveals about average rates for weddings, events, and even New Year's Eve gigs. So by the end, you'll have the crucial industry insights you need to pay your musicians fairly and avoid that band leader's nightmare. And if you're a musician, you're going to want to keep watching too, because it just might be time to command a higher rate from your band leaders. But before we dive into the data, I want to make sure you're getting the best information to build a thriving music career. And I've got a free weekly email where I share my best advice and insights on being a successful band leader. The link to sign up is right below in the description, and it's the perfect way to get expert tips delivered right to your inbox every week. So go get signed up. And hey, if you're enjoying these insights, please do hit the like button below this video. It really helps us out. Now, a quick note on this data. What you're about to see is possibly the first ever data of its kind. You see, Back on Stage is the only platform in the world that specifically facilitates gig payout transactions from band leaders to their musicians. And this means we're uniquely positioned to track and measure this data at scale across numerous countries. So while other content creators talk about average gig rates, their numbers are purely anecdotal. Ours are based on real statistics. And just as a side note, today's numbers are specifically filtered from our Canada and United States dataset. Okay, so let's get into the hard numbers from the Back on Stage database. We analyzed over 30,000 individual musician payouts between September 2020 and July 2025. Now, a quick note on the methodology here. A payout is a single transaction to a musician for a gig, and for each gig type, we filtered out any payout under $70, as we assume these are not really full gigs, but rather more like tips or rehearsals. So this data is the real deal, and it's pulled straight out of our system. So here's the actual breakdown. First of all, we're looking at non-wedding or New Year's Eve gigs. So this category includes everything from corporate events and birthdays to bar, pub, and casino gigs. So we actually had over 16,600 total payouts in this category, and the average for a single musician payout was $335.91. So the lowest was around $70, to be expected, once again, because we filtered out everything below $70. And we also saw payouts as high as $3,045 in this category. So that's for a single musician for a single gig. Pretty impressive. All right, what about weddings? So for this category, we looked at events with the word wedding in their title. So in our system, there really isn't any other way to know if it's a wedding gig or not. Not all band leaders necessarily put wedding in the event title, so we may be missing some gigs from this category, but we are pretty confident to say that it is in fact a wedding if the word wedding is in the event title. So we did have 4,800 of these payouts in the system, and the average musician payout here jumps to a total of $434.20. So that's actually a full $100 more than the payouts in the non-wedding and New Year's Eve category. Once again, the lowest payout was in that $74 range, to be expected, but the highest payout here was a whopping $2,000. Once again, for a single musician for a single gig. So the last category we're going to look at here is New Year's Eve, and this one might surprise you. We tracked 300 total payouts in this category. Kind of interesting that there weren't that many. It seems like New Year's Eve gigs might have been a little quiet for bands using our system in the last few years. But with over 300 payouts in the system, the average rate for a single musician payout was around $763. So more than double a standard gig, not quite double a wedding gig though. Once again, our lowest payout somewhere around $70. And the highest payout in this category, a whopping $3,000 for a single musician at a single gig. And I was actually pretty surprised to see that this was lower than our non-wedding and New Year's Eve category, where the highest payout was $45 more. But certainly on average, New Year's Eve gigs are paying the best. So try to get yourself a New Year's Eve gig this year. Unfortunately, there's only one of those days in a year, but those are definitely the highest earning gigs, followed by weddings, and then followed by the non-wedding and non-New Year's Eve type gigs. But just seeing these numbers can be a little misleading. The truth is that not every gig can pay these rates. So what do you do if you're a new band and venues like bars or pubs just don't have the budget of a wedding? And this was a major problem for me in my early career. I lead a funk band called the Phonics, and when we first started, we were a young developing group that needed stage time, but really couldn't command the high rates that the established bands in town could. So we found a regular gig at a local dive bar, the kind with really sticky floors and dim lighting. And oh man, funny story about sticky floors. I remember distinctly this one night where I was standing on the dance floor talking to someone, and I was wearing those black dress shoes that don't have any laces. They just kind of slip onto your foot. And I went to walk away, and my right shoe stuck right to the dance floor, and my foot just slid right out of it, and it stayed there and did not move with me. The floors were that sticky. So anyway, I digress. But at that venue, we played for the door. So if no one showed up, we got paid nothing. And there were plenty of nights where we played for just 10 or 20 people. And I remember one really stormy Thursday night. There was a snowstorm in town and the buses basically shut down. And we still played our hearts out, but basically for an empty room. And we walked away with barely enough money to cover gas. So the turning point was when I realized that these gigs, while low paying, were still kind of essential. They gave us 7 years of onstage chemistry that you simply can't get in a rehearsal studio. But as time went on, we eventually did outgrow that venue. I mean, it was run down, the sound system was kind of mediocre, and we really weren't being presented in the best light. So I probably pushed that gig for a little too long, and in hindsight, it caused burnout, not just for me, but for the whole band. So at that point, by the end of that gig, we were a premium event band playing at a subpar venue for below standard rates. So the lesson here is that beginning bands do need these low-paying venues to cut their teeth, but as an established band leader, you have a responsibility to know when to outgrow these gigs. So use this data to benchmark your worth, and if you're still playing those low-paying gigs, it might be a sign it's time to move on to where you're truly valued. So this brings us to the next challenge: how to pay your own musicians fairly, even when you, as the band leader, are really the one bringing in all the business. It's a classic problem that can actually create a lot of resentment in a band, and I can vividly remember sitting around with my band years ago in our vocalist's basement having a heated discussion about this, and certain band members felt like they were actually more skilled than others, and our drummer and keyboard player argued that their bulky and expensive instruments raised their costs of doing a gig, but the vocalist felt like all of their extra work in transcribing and memorizing lyrics made for a lot more behind-the-scenes prep time, which they felt also needed to be recognized. So it really felt like we could argue until we were blue in the face about who was actually putting in the most value. But for my funk band, the Phonics, my turning point was deciding to avoid this conflict entirely. We actually chose to pay everyone the same rate just to keep the peace and value everyone's contribution equally. But that's definitely not the only way to do it. You may also need to consider what I call the X factor. For example, I've heard of singers in New York who command a $1,000 to a $1,500 rate for a single gig with an event band. And these aren't just great musicians, they're kind of the X factor. Their incredible skill and reputation are the reasons clients actually book the band in the first place. So you could argue that their talent raises the rate for the entire band, enabling everyone to get a higher paycheck anyway. And on the flip side of that, I've spoken with many band leaders who believe that seniority is something to be taken really seriously as well. So they'll pay a musician who's been with them for 15 or 20 years a higher rate than a brand new sub or a new core member. So it's a powerful tool to incentivize loyalty and reward that long-term commitment. So the lesson here is that you really must apply wisdom to this data. So the average rates, which I'll bring up again here, these are great baselines, but you really need to consider a musician's experience, skill, seniority, and unique value. So use this information to build a pay structure that actually works for your band's unique dynamic, and note that there really is no one right way to do this. Now, quick shameless plug here. If you want to apply all these lessons, you need a system to run your band professionally. You need to be able to send out contracts, track payments, manage your musicians, and handle all that admin stuff without the chaos. So that's exactly what Back on Stage app was built to do. It's a scalable system that takes all that stress out of the business side of your music. So I've put a link in the description below where you can get started with your free 30-day trial if you want to check that out. So go take a look. Now, finally, we have to talk about the biggest issue that can really tear a band apart, and that's the band leader's compensation. So it's a problem of transparency and value. Now, I want to share a story with you about a local band that I know, and I alluded to this in the intro to this video, but they were at a corporate gig. They were hanging out in the green room, and just before they were about to go on stage, the furious event organizer came running in, and in front of the entire band, angrily confronted the band leader, saying something to the effect of, "What the hell, Mr. Band Leader? I'm paying you $10,000, and you still can't get your band on stage on time." Now, there was this tense sort of stunned silence among the musicians. They were each being paid, I think, around $200 for the gig, and I believe this was a 10-piece band. So they all sat there doing the math in their heads, right? 10 musicians at $200 a piece. that's only $2,000. So they realized their band leader was taking this massive $8,000 cut off the top for himself. Now, this immediately created such a rift of betrayal that most of these musicians quit basically on the spot, and within a couple months had started their own rival band to compete directly with their old band leader. And let me tell you, the new band is kind of crushing it. They have tons of gigs. They've already had plenty of connections with well-established wedding planners and are doing very, very well for themselves. So this all happened because the original band leader let that value equation get really skewed. They thought they were padding their own pockets with a few extra bucks, but the cost of losing their best musicians to a direct competitor was far, far greater. So the lesson here is that the cost of your musicians feeling undervalued is far greater than just paying them more. So your compensation as a band leader isn't just a payout for playing the gig. Obviously, it's for all the unseen administrative work, right? The marketing, the sales, and the business costs. But in my own experience running a band, our band leader split typically comes out to around 20 to 50% of the overall gig fee. But definitely not all of that's just going into my pocket, right? My band's straight up operating costs for things like marketing, accounting, and taxes and app fees, those add up to around $10,000 plus a year. So you really have to make sure you're setting aside money from each gig to cover all these essential business costs. And it probably doesn't hurt to communicate some of that to your band members. If you think they're feeling a little undervalued, you might just make it apparent to them that actually there are a lot of expenses in running this business and you need to cover those with the gig fees as well. So don't fall into the trap of thinking your paycheck should be a simple multiple of your musicians. And more importantly, don't let your band members feel undervalued. Be transparent about your value and your expenses so they know and understand why you're taking a larger cut. It's a far better investment than losing them to a brand new competitor. So now that you know the average rates for musicians and the crucial lessons that separate successful bands from the rest, you need to take some action here today. You need a formula to price your entire band so that you can pay your musicians fairly while still running a profitable business and, of course, making a living for yourself. So make sure you go watch this video next where I go deep into the exact formula to price your entire band for profit so that you can get the income you deserve from your gigs and fast. It even includes a really awesome calculator that you can use to determine the best rate for each of your band configurations. So go watch it now. I'll see you there.